Tonight, we begin with the life and ideas of Nikola Tesla, an enigmatic inventor whose brilliance once lit up the world and whose name still hums quietly through the wires of modern innovation. He dreamed of harnessing the raw power of electricity and imagined wireless communication long before the technology existed to make it real. His mind raced far beyond the limits of his era, sketching out futures others couldn't yet see. Yet behind that towering intellect was a deeply human figure, lonely, eccentric, and often tragically misunderstood. Before we settle in, if you enjoy what we share here, we'd be grateful for a like and a subscription. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is for you. We love knowing who's out there with us in the quiet hours. Sometimes our stories are fascinating. Other times, well, we're working on it. For now, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and step together into the world of Nikola Tesla. Tesla entered the world on a night that felt torn between heaven and earth. It was July 10th, 1856, and a fierce thunderstorm raged over the small mountain village of Smiljan, nestled in what was in the Austrian Empire, modern-day Croatia. Wind howled through the trees, lightning split the sky, and by candlelight, Tesla's mother labored to bring him into the world. A nervous midwife whispered that such a storm was a bad omen, but his mother, Duca Tesla, simply smiled and said, "No, he will be a child of light." That phrase would echo through his life like a quiet prophecy. His parents were opposites in many ways. His father, Milutin, was a stern Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of discipline, logic, and letters, who hoped his son would follow a path in the church or academia. His mother, though uneducated in the formal sense, possessed a rare mechanical intuition. She built household tools from scratch, invented clever devices to ease daily chores, and could recite entire epic poems from memory. Tesla would later say she was the true source of his inventive spirit. From an early age, Nikola stood apart. He had a photographic memory, able to read a book once and quote it line for line. His imagination was so vivid that images would appear before his eyes like waking dreams. He began to see flashes of light and experience vision so intense they blurred the line between inner thought and outer reality. He didn't see these as signs of madness, but as a gift, an ability to visualize entire machines in perfect detail, down to the last bolt and spinning gear, long before he ever touched a tool. He was also deeply sensitive to patterns, sounds, and numbers. He developed habits that stayed with him his whole life. He avoided touching hair, couldn't stand the sight of pearls, and was famously fixated on the number 3. If he entered a building, he'd circle it 3 times. These weren't mere quirks. They were expressions of a mind finely tuned to the rhythms of the universe. Even as a boy in Smiljan, Tesla was already dreaming of invisible forces, currents moving through the earth and sky, waiting to be harnessed. The world had no idea what had just been born into its storm, but the future would soon feel the charge. As he grew, so did the scope of his dreams. While other children played or ran through fields, Tesla wandered with questions. Why did birds migrate without maps? What made the stars shimmer? Could energy be drawn directly from the earth itself? He didn't just want answers. He wanted to feel the pulse behind reality. He pursued education with relentless hunger, first in primary school in Karlovac, then at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz. There, surrounded by the ticking of gears and the buzz of early generators, his vision began to take shape. During one lecture, he watched a demonstration of a direct current DC motor, and something in him quietly rebelled. To Tesla, DC felt inefficient, limited, even crude. He imagined something better. Alternating current, AC, a system where energy flowed in waves, powerful and efficient, capable of traveling great distances with minimal loss. His professors dismissed the idea as absurd. But Tesla didn't argue. He simply tucked the vision deep inside, where it grew and refined itself like a living machine waiting to be born. His studies, though brilliant, were cut short by illness, overwork, and financial hardship. He left Graz without a degree and later attended classes in Prague, but never formally graduated. Still, Tesla wasn't deterred. To him, knowledge wasn't something handed down. It was something pursued like a current in the air, invisible, yet everywhere. He spent long nights walking through forests, solving complex equations in his head. He saw turbines spinning in waterfalls, towers drawing power from lightning, and devices sending information through the air. Long before the world imagined such things, Tesla could already feel them humming in his mind. But genius, especially when it's too far ahead of its time, often goes unnoticed. His early ideas were met with skepticism or silence. Yet Tesla kept walking, not for approval, but for something deeper, a vision of a world not built on smoke and wires, but on resonance, vibration, and light. In 1884, Tesla stepped off a ship in New York City with 4 cents in his pocket, a head full of inventions, and a letter of recommendation addressed to one man, Thomas Edison. The city pulsed with chaos, bustling streets, clanging iron, and the newborn glow of electric lights. Edison, already legendary as the Wizard of Menlo Park, ruled that world. He'd invented the phonograph and perfected the light bulb. His company, Edison Machine Works, was expanding fast. Tesla was eager to join. Edison hired him immediately. At first, Tesla admired Edison's tireless work ethic. They both lived on little sleep, driven by an almost obsessive energy. But their methods couldn't have been more different. Edison believed in trial and error, build, break, repeat. Tesla built his machines first in his mind, solving every problem before ever touching a tool. He proposed a redesign of Edison's DC electrical systems, an upgrade that would save time, energy, and money. According to Tesla, Edison laughed. Some say Edison even promised him $50,000 if he succeeded. When Tesla delivered, Edison allegedly brushed it off as a joke. "I don't understand American humor," Tesla reportedly said coldly. Disillusioned, Tesla left. It was a turning point, liberating yet painful. Suddenly, he was jobless, penniless, wandering the streets of Manhattan. For a time, he dug ditches to survive, his hands in the dirt while his mind soared, sketching systems of wireless energy and spinning magnetic fields. Though their rivalry would become legendary, Tesla never truly hated Edison. He once described him as a hard-working man who lacked imagination. Edison, in turn, never grasped the depth of Tesla's vision, or perhaps never cared to. But what Tesla did next would ignite a revolution Edison couldn't stop. Rejection only sharpened his resolve. He became more determined than ever to bring his alternating current system to life. And in doing so, he would challenge the most powerful inventor of his age, not with money or influence, but with light, logic, and the quiet fury of a dreamer scorned. After leaving Edison behind, Tesla spent a year laboring beneath the very city he longed to electrify, digging trenches for underground wiring. Even in those dim, gritty days, his mind never stopped turning. And soon, fate shifted. In 1887, he found backers who believed in his ideas. He opened his own laboratory in Manhattan and began building his AC motors. Unlike Edison's DC system, Tesla's design used rotating magnetic fields and alternating currents, elegant, powerful, and capable of transmitting electricity over vast distances with remarkable efficiency. Word of his breakthrough reached George Westinghouse, an industrialist who had already begun advocating for AC power. He recognized in Tesla the missing piece of a much larger puzzle. In 1888, Westinghouse licensed Tesla's patents, offering him funding, resources, and, for the first time, real recognition. But with progress came resistance. Edison, fearing the collapse of his DC empire, launched a fierce and often cruel campaign against AC, spreading fear, staging public demonstrations, even helping develop the first electric chair to associate AC with danger and death. Yet none of it could stop what Tesla had set in motion. The current was already flowing. It wasn't just business. It was a war of ideas. And Edison, sensing his empire under threat, was prepared to fight dirty. He launched a public smear campaign against alternating current, staging gruesome demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted using AC power. He labeled it dangerous, deadly, even unnatural. He even backed the development of the electric chair, deliberately powered by AC, and pushed to have it branded as the execution current, hoping to forever link Tesla's invention with death in the public mind. Despite the theatrics and fear-mongering, Tesla remained calm. He trusted the science. And in 1893, that trust was vindicated. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago awarded its massive lighting contract to Westinghouse and Tesla. It was AC's moment in the sun, and what a moment it was. Over 100,000 electric bulbs illuminated the fairgrounds with a brilliance the world had never seen. Crowds stood in awe as machines whirred, danced, and dazzled, all powered by Tesla's alternating current. It wasn't just a technical triumph. It was a glimpse into the future. Soon after, Tesla's system was chosen to harness the raw power of Niagara Falls, marking the birth of the world's first large-scale hydroelectric plant. For the first time, an entire city, Buffalo, New York, was powered not by coal or steam, but by water and current alone. Tesla had won the war of currents, not with spectacle or sabotage, but with vision, elegance, and the quiet certainty of a better idea. Yet, as often happens, the spotlight began to drift. While the world celebrated the dawn of electric modernity, Tesla quietly turned his mind to the next great challenge. He had lit the earth. Now he wondered, could he do the same for the sky? With AC humming through cities and across rivers, Tesla could have rested on his laurels. But he was never one to stand still. While others saw wires, profits, and patents, Tesla saw something deeper: resonance, invisible energy in the air, a planet vibrating with untapped potential. He believed the Earth itself could act as a conductor. That electricity could be transmitted wirelessly through the ground, through the atmosphere, even across oceans. In the late 1890s, he moved to Colorado Springs, drawn by its wide-open skies and isolation, perfect for the strange experiments brewing in his mind. There, on the edge of town, he built a massive laboratory crowned with a towering Tesla coil. Like a modern-day alchemist, he began pulling lightning from the heavens. At night, locals watched in awe and fear as arcs of electricity, sometimes over 100 feet long, leapt from his tower into the dark sky, lighting up the plains. Rumors spread. Was he controlling the weather? Summoning forces beyond human understanding? The ground around his lab would crackle with stray currents, and he accidentally fried the town's power station more than once. But Tesla didn't care. He was chasing something far beyond local gossip. In his private journals, he wrote of receiving mysterious signals, repeating patterns he believed might be messages from intelligent life on Mars. Most dismiss him as delusional, but Tesla wasn't trying to convince anyone. He was mapping a new reality. He envisioned a global network of towers broadcasting energy wirelessly, powering ships at sea, lighting remote villages, connecting voices across continents without a single wire. Years before Marconi's radio triumph or the rise of cell towers, Tesla was already dreaming of a truly wireless world. But while Tesla dreamed of universal energy, others dreamed of profit. Investors wanted patents they could control, systems they could meter, and returns they could count. They couldn't grasp or trust a technology that gave energy away for free. In Colorado, Tesla's machine sang with resonance and possibility, but he was once again too far ahead of his time, working in a world that preferred walls, wires, and ownership over open skies and shared abundance. He returned to New York not with finished invention, but with a vision, a map of an invisible network drawn in blue arcs and whispered frequencies, a future not yet built, but waiting patiently in the silence between signals. Back in the city, Tesla set his sights on his boldest project yet, a wireless power station that could transmit energy across the globe. With blueprint in hand and fire in his eyes, he approached J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers of the age. Tesla promised something extraordinary, a tower that could send wireless messages across the Atlantic and, eventually, provide free energy to the entire planet. Morgan, intrigued by the communication angle, agreed to fund the project. In 1901, construction began on Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island's North Shore. Rising 187 feet into the sky, with a deep shaft driven into the earth to anchor its vibrations, it looked like something between a cathedral and a lightning rod, crowned with copper dome that seemed to hum with possibility. But Tesla's true intentions remained elusive. He spoke little of profit. Instead, he dreamed of a world where ships could draw power from the air, where every home, no matter how remote, could glow with light, and where no one would ever pay for electricity again. When Morgan realized Tesla's ultimate goal was to give energy away freely, his support vanished. "Where do I put the meter?" he reportedly asked. And when Tesla had no answer because there was no meter to be found, the funding dried up. Around the same time, Guglielmo Marconi, using technology based on Tesla's own patents, successfully transmitted the first transatlantic radio signal. The world hailed Marconi as a hero. Tesla, once again, faded from the headlines, not outsmarted, but outmaneuvered by a system that valued control over generosity. Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. The lab fell silent. The great transmitter stood unused for years, a haunting monument to a dream too vast for its time. In 1917, during World War I, the tower was dismantled and sold for scrap. Tesla watched his greatest vision collapse into rust and memory, yet the idea behind it never died. Even as the metal was carted away, he believed the world would one day return to his vision, not for wealth, but for harmony, for a future where energy flows as freely as wind, quiet and abundant, waiting only for someone brave enough to listen again to the silence between the sparks. By the 1920s, Nikola Tesla had become a ghost of the man who once lit world's fairs and summoned lightning from the sky. His name rarely appeared in newspapers. His patents had been sold, forgotten, or credited to others. Yet in a modest hotel room high above the streets of Manhattan, Tesla continued to dream. He moved often, sometimes skipping rent, living alone among stacks of notes, half-built devices, and worn books. Outside, the modern age roared forward. Cars filled the avenues. Radios played in living rooms. Skyscrapers climbed toward the clouds. Much of it ran on principles Tesla had pioneered, but few remembered. With age, his eccentricities deepened. He dressed impeccably in tailored suits and white gloves, even when he couldn't afford a meal. He avoided shaking hands, believing human contact disrupted his inner balance. Numbers held sacred meaning for him, especially the number 3. He would circle a building 3 times before entering, touch a doorknob 3 times, walk 3 blocks before turning. These weren't random habits. They were rituals aligned with a hidden order only he could perceive. His closest companions weren't people, but pigeons. Every day, he fed them in Bryant Park, speaking to them softly as if they understood. One white dove, in particular, captured his heart. She visited his hotel window regularly, and he claimed to love her as one loves another human being. When she fell ill, he nursed her himself, and when she died, he said he saw a beam of light flash from her eyes, a sign he believed that his life's work was complete. Newspapers occasionally interviewed him, often highlighting his more outlandish claims about death rays or signals from Mars. To many, he was just an odd old man in a dusty room, muttering about impossible things. But inside Tesla's mind, the universe still thrummed with vibration and frequency. Even as the world dismissed him, he remained tethered to the future, not by fame or fortune, but by an unshakable desire to understand the invisible forces that connect everything. And so, high above Manhattan, in the dim glow of a hotel lamp, the final chapters of forgotten genius unfolded, one quiet dream at a time. Tesla's end came softly. No crowds gathered. No speeches were made. Just silence. On January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, Nikola Tesla passed away alone at the age of 86. A maid discovered his body the next morning, lying peacefully in bed. The room was filled with papers, notebooks, small inventions, and the quiet hum of mind that never stopped working. He died with few possessions and even fewer visitors. His debts were many, his name nearly forgotten, but the ideas he left behind, scattered in drawers, scribbled in margins, hidden in stacks of blueprints, would echo far beyond that quiet hotel room. When news of his death reached Washington, the U.S. government acted swiftly. FBI agents seized his documents, fearing they contained secrets too powerful or too dangerous to be left unguarded. Rumors swirled. Had he really invented a death ray? Had he unlocked the secret of limitless energy? The truth lay tangled in his notes, some complete, some cryptic, some lost forever. Though his final years were spent in obscurity, the world would slowly begin to remember, not just the inventions, but the vision, the belief that technology should serve humanity, not profit, that energy should be free, that the future belongs not to those who control it, but to those who imagine it first. And in that sense, Tesla never really left us. He's still here, in every flicker of light, every wireless signal, every spark that leaps from idea to reality. Later that same year, in a quiet but significant legal decision, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated Guglielmo Marconi's claim to the invention of radio, officially restoring Tesla's patent and granting him the long-overdue credit he deserved. It was a correction buried in dense legal text, unnoticed by most, but it mattered deeply. The man who had once whispered of wireless worlds, dismissed as a dreamer or a madman, had been right all along. Tesla was buried in a simple, modest service attended only by a few loyal friends and quiet admirers. There were no parades, no grand monuments, no fanfare. But those who had known him, who had stood beside his humming coils, witnessed his mind in motion, or simply felt the weight of his vision, understood the magnitude of what the world had lost. He hadn't lived for riches or applause. He lived for discovery, for the pursuit of the unknown, for the quiet beauty hidden in the patterns of light, sound, and energy. And though his final years were spent in solitude, Tesla always insisted he was never truly alone. To him, the universe itself was companion. Its vibrations, its frequencies, its endless mystery a constant dialogue only he seemed to hear. He died, quietly, yes, but somewhere in the background hum of the very world he helped create, his energy still lingers. Soft, brilliant, eternal. Nikola Tesla may have passed in silence, but the world he shaped has never stopped speaking his name. Today, his fingerprints are everywhere. In the power lines that crisscross our cities, in the wireless signals that circle the globe, in the machines that move without cords, and in the devices that hum quietly in our pockets. Alternating current, remote controls, induction motors, neon lighting, radio waves, all trace their lineage back to his restless mind. He saw the earth not as mere rock and soil, but as a vast conductor, a living vessel of energy waiting to be tapped, shared, and understood. He believed the future wouldn't be built with wires, but with resonance, not through domination, but through harmony. Though others profited from his ideas, Tesla never chased wealth. He died poor, but never bitter. In his heart, he believed ideas belonged to everyone. That knowledge was a form of light. And even if the world moved slowly, he trusted that, in time, the current would flow. Decades after his death, his legacy began to rise again. Scientists, engineers, and historians revisited his work with fresh eyes. Statues were erected in his honor. Books were written. Schools and laboratories bore his name. And in the 21st century, his vision found new life. Not just in textbooks, but in electric cars that bear his name, in cutting-edge energy research, and in the minds of those who look up at the stars and wonder, what if? But perhaps Tesla's truest legacy isn't a single invention, a tower, or even a patent. It's the example he left behind, of a mind that dared to dream far beyond the limits of its time, of a man who walked alone, not because he lacked company, but because his path had never been walked before. Tesla taught us that the future belongs to the dreamers, to the quiet thinkers, to those who seem lost in thought while the world rushes by, because often within them burns a spark that will one day light the way for us all. So tonight, as the noise of the day fades and you drift towards sleep, remember this. Somewhere between silence and electricity, between science and wonder, the spirit of Nikola Tesla still hums. Timeless, invisible, and waiting to be heard. Long ago, on the shimmering edge of the Mediterranean Sea, a city rose from vision. Its name was Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BCE. Though Alexander would die young and never see his dream fully realized, his spirit lingered in its marble streets, sea-swept harbors, and grand ambitions. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy Isoter, often called Ptolemy the Founder, took control of Egypt and made Alexandria his capital. Under his rule and that of his successors, the city blossomed into something rare in the ancient world. Not just a hub of trade or power, but a sanctuary of learning. Inspired by Greek philosophy and the teachings of Aristotle, Ptolemy envisioned a place where all the world's knowledge could gather. A home not just for scrolls, but for wisdom itself. A place where humanity's deepest questions about life, the cosmos, and existence could be asked openly, patiently, without fear. From this vision, the Library of Alexandria was born. It began not with stone or columns, but with an idea that knowledge should not be hoarded by kings or hidden in temples, but gathered, preserved, and shared. The library was part of a larger institution called the Malsion, the Temple of the Muses, dedicated to the divine inspirations of art, science, and thought. Together, they became the intellectual heartbeat of Alexandria. The goal was breathtaking in its scope: to collect every book, every scroll, every fragment of human thought, in every language, from every corner of the known world. Agents were dispatched to Athens, Babylon, Carthage, and even India. Ships docking in Alexandria's great harbor were searched. Any books found aboard were confiscated, copied by scribes, and often kept. The originals archived, the copies returned to their owners. Nothing was too obscure, too sacred, or too foreign to be included. Estimates of the library's holdings vary wildly. Some say 40,000 scrolls. Others claim over 400,000. But the number matters less than the spirit behind it. These weren't just rolls of papyrus. They were voices. Scrolls on astronomy from Mesopotamia, surgical techniques from Egypt, mathematical principles from India, philosophical dialogues from Greece, religious texts in Hebrew, Persian, and Sanskrit, all coexisted under one roof. The Library of Alexandria wasn't Greek alone. It was global. Among its rumored treasures were the lost plays of Aeschylus, star charts from ancient Babylon, early maps of the heavens, and writings so old they've since vanished from history. But the library was more than a warehouse of words. Every text was carefully copied, translated, studied, and debated. Scholars didn't just preserve knowledge. They refined it, challenged it, expanded upon it. Imagine a place where a student could read the Vedas in the morning, consult Aristotle by midday, study Babylonian eclipse records in the afternoon, and then debate cosmology over dinner with the greatest minds of the age. That was Alexandria. Each scroll carried the echo of another time, another mind, another world. And within those halls, for a brief, luminous moment in human history, civilization tried to listen to them all. This wasn't just a collection. It was a conversation, centuries long, ever-growing, and astonishingly alive. The Library of Alexandria was never merely a building filled with scrolls. It was a living, breathing world of minds in motion. And at its center stood the Malsion, a sanctuary not just for books, but for the very act of wondering, creating, and connecting across time, language, and culture. This was more than symbolic. The Malsion functioned much like a modern university or research institute. It provided housing, food, and stipend for scholars from across the known world. Here, thinkers weren't weighed down by the daily struggle to survive. They were free to read, write, debate, and explore ideas without limit. They lived within the grounds, surrounded by gardens, lecture halls, laboratories, and observatories. It was a quiet place, yes, but not silent. The air hummed with the gentle rustle of scrolls, the scratch of pens on parchment, and the soft murmur of conversation in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and other tongues, all blending into a symphony of thought. Among those who walked these halls were some of the greatest minds in human history. Euclid, the father of geometry, laid down the logical foundations that still shape mathematics today. Eratosthenes, head librarian, used nothing but shadows and sticks to calculate the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. Herophilus dissected human bodies, mapping the nervous system and identifying the brain as the seat of thought centuries before such ideas gained acceptance. And Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, suggesting the Earth revolved around the sun, an idea the world would not embrace until Copernicus, over 1,700 years later. Within the library and the Malsion, there were no rigid boundaries between disciplines. Philosophy mingled with science. Mathematics inspired poetry. Medicine drew from astronomy. Knowledge wasn't fragmented. It was seen as interconnected, like the stars above or the roots of a great tree. This environment created something rare, not just the preservation of knowledge, but its acceleration. Questions weren't feared. They were welcomed. Truth wasn't declared. It was pursued. And wisdom wasn't owned. It was shared. In those marble chambers and vine-covered courtyards, the human mind was given space to stretch, to wander, to wonder. And for a brief, luminous time in the heart of Alexandria, the world seemed to remember what it meant to seek truth without fear. For years, the Library of Alexandria stood as a beacon of light in a world still shadowed by ignorance. But no light, however brilliant, is immune to the storms of politics and war. In 48 BCE, Alexandria became a battleground. Julius Caesar, entangled in the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII, arrived with Roman legions. When hostilities erupted near the harbor, Caesar, under siege, ordered the docks set ablaze to prevent enemy ships from surrounding him. What happened next remains debated, but the fire leapt from the wooden piers to nearby buildings. Some ancient accounts suggest it reached warehouses storing scrolls from the library. If true, this may have been the first major blow to its vast collection. Was it the main library that burned, or merely an annex along the harbor? Historians still disagree. Some sources claim tens of thousands of scrolls were lost. Others argue the damage was partial. Yet the very idea that centuries of human thought could vanish in a single night of fire is almost too tragic to bear. Imagine it. Medical treatises destroyed before they could heal. Star charts turned to ash. Theories of the cosmos, biology, and philosophy erased in the blink of a flame. But the fire wasn't only physical. In the years that followed, the library faced slower, quieter threats. Political instability, shifting rulers, dwindling funds. Scholars drifted away. Guardians of wisdom grew fewer. Still, the dream endured. Some scrolls survived. Some minds remained. The flame flickered, but it didn't go out. Destruction, after all, is rarely a single event. It's a long, slow unraveling. And in Alexandria, the fire may have begun with Caesar's torches, but it would take centuries to finish what that first spark had started. Even so, something ancient lingered in the ashes. The belief that once knowledge is kindled, it can never be fully extinguished. Though Caesar's fire may have damaged the library, the vision it embodied did not vanish overnight. Alexandria remained a city of scholars, and the thirst for understanding persisted. Out of necessity and hope, a second library rose. It found its home in the Serapeum, a grand temple on a hill above the city, dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god of wisdom, healing, and light. Within the Serapeum's cool stone chambers, thousands of scrolls were housed, perhaps copies of those once held in the great library, or new works added by later generations. It became a continuation of the original dream, a place where scholars could still read, teach, and imagine. In essence, it was the library's second life. But the world outside was changing. Alexandria, once the jewel of Hellenistic civilization, was being absorbed into the Roman Empire. Emperors came and went. Public interest in pure scholarship waned. Resources dried up. Yet the Serapeum endured. Students still gathered under its marble arches, debated beneath olive trees, and kept the old conversations alive, however faintly. This fragile continuation, however, could not last forever. By the 4th century CE, a new force was reshaping the ancient world. The rise of Christianity. Pagan temples, once revered as centers of wisdom, were now seen as symbols of heresy. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius I ordered all pagan temples closed. In Alexandria, this decree turned violent. Christian mobs, led by Bishop Theophilus, stormed the Serapeum. Statues were shattered. The temple was destroyed. Whether scrolls still remained inside is unknown. Some say they'd already been moved. Others believe they perished in the chaos. Truth and legend blur here, as they often do when fire and faith collide. What's certain is this: another chapter of Alexandria's legacy closed in smoke and silence. Yet even in ruin, the idea lived on, because dreams like this, shared across generations, do not end with fire. They linger, waiting to be reborn. As centuries passed, Alexandria transformed under new empires and new beliefs. The Roman world shifted eastward to Constantinople. The old institutions of learning, once nourished by royal patronage, were left to crumble. The Malseion fell silent. Gardens grew wild. Scrolls scattered or decayed. And by the 4th century, Christianity had become the empire's dominant faith, not just tolerated, but enforced. The rich tapestry of gods and philosophies gave way to a single path guided by doctrine. In this new climate, Curiosity could be dangerous. Questions gave way to unquestionable truths. Alexandria remained, but it was no longer the lighthouse of learning it had once been. Still, beneath the dust and silence, echoes of old voices lingered, not waiting for resurrection, but for remembrance. And in those final twilight years, one last brilliant light flickered in the city's shadowed streets. Her name was Hypatia. Born around 360 CE, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a respected mathematician and astronomer. From childhood, she immersed herself in numbers, stars, and philosophy, and quickly surpassed her father in brilliance. She became a renowned teacher of Neoplatonism, an expert in astronomy, and a public intellectual at a time when women were rarely seen, let alone heard, in such roles. She wore the robes of philosopher not for show, but as a statement of conviction. She walked freely through Alexandria, teaching students of all faiths and backgrounds. To many, she was more than a scholar. She was a symbol, a voice of reason and calm amid rising religious and political storms. But the world around her was growing hostile. Christianity had become dominant, and tensions flared between rival factions. In the early 400s, Bishop Cyril rose to power, clashing with Orestes, the Roman governor and a pagan sympathizer, and an ally of Hypatia, though Hypatia stayed out of politics. Her very presence was a threat. She was respected by both sides, too respected. In times of fear and power struggles, wisdom is often the first casualty. Her independence, intellect, and unwavering commitment to reason made her a target. In 415 CE, she was attacked by a mob believed to be religious extremists aligned with Cyril's faction. Dragged from her chariot, she was brutally murdered, her body burned in the streets. The details are harrowing, but the message was clear. With her death, the final page of Alexandria's golden age turned. Hypatia wasn't just a scholar lost. She was a living embodiment of what Alexandria had once stood for, a city where minds were free, where questions were sacred, and where learning was an act of hope. Her name survives, not because she built monuments or led armies, but because she dared to think and paid the ultimate price for refusing to stop. When we speak of the Library of Alexandria, we often picture fire, flames consuming shells of scrolls, ashes drifting into the sea breeze. But the true loss is harder to measure. It's not just what burned, it's what never reached us. No one knows exactly what was lost. The library's collection was never fully cataloged. In an age before printing, every scroll was a fragile thread between generations. Some believe we lost the final plays of Sophocles, early Buddhist texts translated into Greek, Babylonian astronomical records, Egyptian surgical manuals, Persian philosophical treatises, or Indian mathematical insights. There may have been maps drawn centuries before European explorers sailed, theories of atoms, observations of comets, even glimpses of mechanics or optics that wouldn't reappear for millennia. But more than the documents, it was the moment that was lost. For one of the first times in history, people from across the world, Babylonian astronomers, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Indian mathematicians, had gathered not to conquer, but to understand. The library wasn't just a collection. It was a connection. And when it fell, that thread unraveled. The loss of Alexandria wasn't just a tragedy of ink and papyrus. It was a fracture in the continuity of human knowledge. Progress paused. Ideas once discussed freely had to be rediscovered, sometimes centuries, even millennia later, through painstaking effort. We mourn the library not only for what it held, but for what it represented. A time when curiosity was sacred, when learning had no borders, and when the brightest minds had gathered in peace, fearing only one thing, forgetting. And though the scrolls are gone, the silence they left behind still asks a haunting question. What might we become if the flame had never gone out? Yet even in loss, the light endured. It flickered through the ages. In the libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba, in monasteries that preserved ancient texts through Europe's darkest centuries, in translators who carried Greek wisdom through Arabic and back into Latin, in the first universities where minds were once again allowed to wonder. And now, in our time, that same dream lives in our hands. It lives in books, in digital archives storing centuries of thought, in the glow of a screen as a child reads their first poem or a scientist deciphers the language of stars. What Alexandria began wasn't just a gathering of knowledge. It was a radical belief that knowledge belongs to everyone, that truth should not be hoarded, but shared, like a flame passed from hand to hand, lighting the way forward. We can never recover what was lost in those ancient halls, but we can honor it. Every time we learn, teach, question, explore, or create, we become part of the same story. A story that began in stone and scrolls, in whispering courtyards, where humanity first dared to look beyond the known and dream of what could be. The Library of Alexandria was never just a place. It was a promise that even in a world of fire and forgetting, there will always be those who carry the light, quietly, patiently, together. So as the night deepens and the world grows still, know this. Somewhere in the turning of a page, in the quiet of your own thoughts, Alexandria still breathes, and its light still burns in you. In the early morning of May 24th, 1819, a child was born in Kensington Palace. She was small, delicate, and unremarkable in the eyes of the royal court. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, chosen to honor her godfather, Tsar Alexander of Russia. Few expected this quiet child to ever wear the crown. At her birth, she was fifth in line to the British throne, distant from power, seemingly destined for a life on the margins of royalty. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, died of pneumonia just months after her birth. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was left alone, grieving, cautious, and determined to protect her daughter's fragile claim to the throne. She raised Victoria under a strict regime known as the Kensington system, a rigid set of rules designed to keep the young princess under constant supervision. Victoria was never allowed to be alone, not even to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. Her friendships were controlled, her education closely monitored. Her world was narrow, but her mind was wide awake. She found refuge in books and in her diary, where she began recording her thoughts with striking clarity. Even as a child, her writing revealed a strong will, keen observation, and deep emotion. Beneath her obedient exterior burned a fierce independence. Her isolation made her watchful. Her restrictions made her resilient. As unexpected deaths among her royal relatives moved her closer to the throne, Victoria came to understand her destiny. By her teenage years, she was heir presumptive. At just 11 years old, it said she studied a family tree and quietly declared, "I will be good." It was a simple promise, but one that would echo through an empire. That promise, whispered in a child's voice, would echo through one of the longest and most transformative reigns in British history. She had been born in a palace, raised behind walls, but history was waiting beyond them, and the quiet girl with the serious eyes was about to step into the light. On a gray June morning in 1837, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace. King William IV had died in the night. His niece, Princess Victoria, had just turned 18, old enough to rule in her own right. When the men delivered the news, she stood quietly and said, with composure far beyond her years, "I will do my utmost to be worthy of my people." It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for an entire empire. Victoria's first moments as queen were marked by quiet strength. One of her very first acts was to request that she move out of her mother's apartments and into her own chambers at Buckingham Palace. It was a subtle gesture, but a firm one. For the first time in her life, she was alone and free. Though she was now sovereign, she lacked experience. She leaned heavily on Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who became a kind, fatherly figure in her life. His guidance gave her confidence, though some accused him of wielding too much influence over the young queen. Still, he was patient, respectful, and steady, a calming presence in a world of uncertainty. Yet her early reign was not without missteps. She made enemies by interfering in court appointments, especially among the Tories. She was criticized for her close attachment to favorites, and a scandal involving her lady-in-waiting stirred political unrest. She was learning, often painfully, how treacherous court life could be. But through it all, Victoria took her duties seriously. She read every document placed before her, insisted on understanding the details of government affairs, and attended meetings with ministers. She believed deeply in the weight of her role. Still, there was no denying the loneliness. She was surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and attendants, but few true friends. Her mother remained distant. Her court was steeped in protocol. Every word, every step, was watched and weighed. Victoria was a queen, but she was also a young woman, newly thrust into the harsh light of power. In the quiet halls of her palace, she ruled alone and waited for someone to stand beside her, not as a subject, but as a partner. In October 1839, that someone arrived. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin from Germany, came to Buckingham Palace. They had met once before as children, but now, at 20 and newly secure in her role as queen, Victoria saw him differently. When they met again, something shifted inside her. That very day, she wrote in her diary, *, "It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert. He is so handsome, so delightful." *, just 5 days later, she proposed him. As queen, it was her right to ask. He accepted. They were married on February 10, 1840, in a simple ceremony at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore white, a choice that would spark a lasting bridal tradition, and a wreath of orange blossoms. Rain tapped gently against the windows as crowds gathered outside in celebration. Their marriage began as a deep and joyful love. Victoria adored Albert. She called him her angel, her dearest treasure, and he, in turn, became far more than a husband. He became her closest advisor. With his keen mind and quiet discipline, Albert brought order to Victoria's passionate, sometimes impulsive nature. They were opposites. She fiery and emotional, he reserved and methodical, but together they formed a powerful partnership. Though he held no official title beyond Prince Consort, Albert immersed himself in the work of the crown. He helped modernize the monarchy, advised ministers, championed science and education, and played a central role in organizing the Great Exhibition of 1851, a dazzling showcase of global innovation. They had 9 children, and Victoria found great joy in motherhood, though not without struggle. She suffered from postpartum depression and often felt torn between public duty and private life. But her love for Albert never wavered. When he traveled, she wrote him letter after letter. When he returned, she greeted him with tears of joy. He was her confidant, her guide, her balance, her anchor. But life, even for queens, does not grant forever. In the winter of 1861, Prince Albert fell ill. At first, it seemed like exhaustion. He had been overworked, distressed by a scandal involving their son Bertie, and burdened by years of responsibility. But his condition worsened rapidly. Fever set in. Doctors were uncertain. Some diagnosed typhoid fever. Others suspected a deeper, chronic illness. On December 14, 1861, at just 42 years old, Albert died in Windsor Castle. Victoria was shattered. The world she had built with him, filled with letters, shared decisions, laughter, and quiet evenings, collapsed into silence. The next day, she put on black mourning clothes. She would wear them for the rest of her life. For more than a decade, she withdrew from public view. She refused to return to Buckingham Palace, preferring the solitude of Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Parliament grew impatient. Newspapers criticized her absence. Some even questioned her fitness to rule. Yet though she vanished from sight, she never abandoned her duties. From her secluded rooms, she continued to govern, reading state papers, corresponding with ministers, signing every official document. Her grief was profound, but it did not extinguish her sense of responsibility. Her mourning became legendary. She kept Albert's rooms exactly as he left them, his clothes laid out each morning, his shaving water delivered daily, as if he might walk in at any moment. His image filled her homes, in portraits, photographs, and keepsakes. She wrote of him constantly in her diary, calling him her beloved, her precious angel. Every triumph, every sorrow, was filtered through the lens of his loss. To her children, this devotion was both touching and suffocating. They lived in the long shadow of a ghost. And yet in her sorrow, Victoria shaped something enduring. The image of the grieving widow dignified, steadfast, wrapped in black. Her grief became part of her reign, part of her identity. She ruled alone for 40 more years, but she never again smiled as she once had. The heart of an empire beat on, but deep within, a quiet chamber of sorrow remained sealed and sacred. While Victoria mourned in seclusion, the British Empire surged forward into its greatest age of expansion. By the late 1800s, it spanned every continent, from Canada to Australia, the Caribbean to Africa, and at its glittering center, India. People proudly declare that the sun never set on the British Empire. Victoria watched this expansion from a distance. She was not a military leader, nor did she command armies, but she became the living symbol of imperial unity. In 1876, at the urging of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, she accepted the title Empress of India. Though ceremonial, it carried immense symbolic weight. She never visited India, yet she felt a deep connection to it. Studying its languages, reading about its cultures, and later welcoming Indian servants into her household, most notably Abdul Karim, who became a trusted friend and confidant in her final years. To many in Britain, the title confirmed her global stature. But to those living under colonial rule, the crown often represented control, extraction, and lost autonomy. Victoria herself held complex views. She disliked racial prejudice and often defended her Indian subject against the arrogance of her own court. Yet she also believed in Britain's civilizing mission, a common conviction of her era, though one steeped in the blind certainty of empire. The empire brought wealth, railways, telegraph, and innovation to Britain, but at a cost paid by millions across the globe. Victoria, draped in mourning black, presided over this vast web of dominion. Her face appeared on stamps that crossed oceans, on coins exchanged in desert markets and mountain villages. She was distant, yet everywhere she had become more than a monarch. She was an idea of stability, tradition, and imperial order. Though she rarely left Britain again, her presence was felt in lands she would never see, her reign stretching across borders and time. Yet for all her global influence, Victoria's private world was ruled by something far more unpredictable: family. She and Albert had 9 children, and through careful matchmaking, she placed them in royal houses across Europe, earning her the nickname the Grandmother of Europe. Her descendants sat on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Romania, and Spain. Through blood and marriage, she wove her family into the very fabric of the continent. But royal blood did not guarantee harmony. Victoria had high expectations, and she rarely hesitated to voice her disappointments. She meddled in her children's marriages, criticized their choices, and struggled to let them live independently. Her letters, though loving, were often laced with demands or disapproval. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, married the future German emperor. Intelligent and idealistic like Albert, she was deemed too liberal and too far away. Her son Bertie, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, caused her endless worry. Social, flirtatious, uninterested in books. She compared him unfavorably to Albert and doubted his ability to rule. Their relationship remained strained for decades. Other children faced their own tragedies: illness, early deaths, political turmoil. Her son Leopold suffered from hemophilia, and her daughter Alice passed the gene into other royal families, including Russia's Romanovs, where will haunt the dooms are Nicholas II and his son Alexei. Victoria's love was deep, but her grip was tight. She could not bear separation, even as her children became rulers in their own right. The very web she spun across Europe would one day become a trap. In 1914, her grandchildren would lead nations into World War I, fighting each other from opposite trenches. In the halls of Windsor and Balmoral, family portraits hang in golden frames, smiling, united. But beneath the titles and silks lay quiet resentments, fragile alliances, and the unspoken truth that even queens cannot command the hearts of those they raise. After Albert's death, Victoria sought solace not in London's glittering courts, but in the rugged highlands of Scotland. At Balmoral Castle, she found what her palaces could not offer: solitude, fresh air, and honest company. And among the staff, one man stood out: John Brown. A Scottish servant with rough manners, plain speech, and unwavering loyalty, Brown quickly became more than an employee. He walked beside her on long highland walks, managed her horses, guarded her privacy with fierce devotion. She trusted him, confided in him, even laughed with him, something rare in her later years. He called her simply woman, a term no one else dared use. She called him my best, truest friend. He stood close during rides, accompanied her everywhere at Balmoral, and even had a room near hers. Their closeness sparked rumors, whispers of romance, even secret marriage. Courtiers bristled. Her family grew uneasy, but Victoria refused to let him go. Whatever the truth of their bond, Brown gave her something irreplaceable: companionship without ceremony, affection without judgment. With him, she felt safe. When he died suddenly in 1883, she was devastated. She commissioned statues in his honor, kept his portrait nearby, and wrote pages mourning his loss. She even placed a personal inscription on his grave, a rare gesture from a monarch to a servant. John Brown had no title, no crown, but in the long, lonely decades of her widowhood, he had filled a space no one else could. And though he left no legacy in history books, his presence lingered in the wind-swept paths of Balmoral, in the Queen's softened gaze, and in the quiet memory of the man who once dared to walk beside her not as a subject, but as a friend. In 1897, Queen Victoria reached a milestone few monarchs ever see: 60 years on the throne. The Diamond Jubilee was not a quiet affair. It was a global spectacle, a celebration of empire at its zenith. From every corner of the world, dignitaries, soldiers, and colonial leaders poured into London. Streets blazed with color. Bells rang across the kingdom. Victoria, now in her late 70s, was frail, nearly wheelchair-bound, her eyesight failing, but she carried a quiet majesty. On June 22nd, she appeared in her carriage, dressed in black with silver and white accents. Crowds erupted in cheers. They saw not just a queen, but an era made flesh. The grand procession wound through London. Troops from India in vibrant uniforms, representatives from Canada, Australia, South Africa, and beyond. As her carriage passed St. Paul's Cathedral, she chose not to climb the steps. Instead, a short Thanksgiving service was held outside, beneath the open sky, surrounded by her people. She sat quietly, hands folded, eyes cast down. The weight of 6 decades of love, loss, war, invention, and empire rested gently on her shoulders. It was more than a royal event. It was a national moment of unity, a final golden chapter in the long story of her reign. Victoria had outlived her husband, many friends, and even some of her own children. She had reigned through revolutions and railways, through grief and glory. And now, at the center of an empire unlike any the world had seen, she sat as its matriarch. The girl who once wept behind Kensington's walls had become the sovereign of a global realm. And for one shining day, the whole world seemed to pause and say, "Thank you." By the turn of the century, Victoria was more than a monarch. She was a symbol of duty, resilience, continuity. Generations had known no other ruler. Her silhouette, her sorrow, her steadfast presence had defined an age. But even queens must yield to time. In the winter of 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Victoria's health faded. Her strength waned. The woman who had ruled for 63 years now needed help to sit upright. Her children and grandchildren gathered at her bedside. On January 22, 1901, as twilight settled over the empire she had shaped for so long, Queen Victoria passed away, quietly, peacefully, and with the dignity that had marked her entire reign. She left behind a transformed world, and a legacy that would echo far beyond her lifetime. The Victorian age had ended, but the girl who once whispered, "I will be good," had kept her promise. To her people, to history, and to quiet light of duty that guided her from palace corridors to the pages of eternity. She was 81 years old. The world mourned. Bells tolled in London, and black crape draped windows across continents. In India, Africa, Australia, and Canada, flags were lowered to half-mast. Leaders across Europe sent tributes, not just as statesmen, but as her descendants. She had truly been the grandmother of Europe, and her family now ruled in palaces from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Her funeral was unlike any other, crafted according to her own wishes. She had asked not for the heavy solemnity of traditional royal mourning, but for something tender and personal. She was not buried in black, but in white, the color of her wedding day. Over her face, she wore her bridal veil, the same one she had worn when she married Albert more than 60 years before. She was laid to rest beside him in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, reuniting the love story that had shaped her soul and defined her reign. With her death, the Victorian era came to a close. She had ruled through revolutions, wars, and the birth of the modern age. Under her reign, Britain had transformed from a land of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages into a nation of telegraphs, steam engines, and electricity. She had watched her country rise to become a global power. And yet, through it all, she remained rooted in tradition, duty, and deep personal conviction. Victoria was not always adored. She could be stubborn, commanding, even imperious. But she was also deeply human, capable of profound love, devastating grief, and unwavering loyalty. Her devotion to her country never wavered. She reigned longer than any British monarch before her, 63 years and 216 days. And when she finally closed her eyes, a chapter in history ended not with fanfare, but with the soft silence of a queen who had given her entire life to a crown and a people. There was a time when Egyptian hieroglyphs were not a mystery. When priests and scribes carved prayers, laws, and royal decrees into temple walls and tomb chambers, every curve of a bird, every stroke of a reed held precise meaning. The temples of Karnak, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, these were not silent ruins. They once pulsed with stories, names, divine poetry, and the voices of civilization speaking directly to the gods and to eternity. But time, as it often does, closed the book. As centuries passed, Egypt was conquered, first by Persians, then by Greeks, and later by Romans. Each new ruler brought new languages, new customs. The old ways faded. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis on Philae Island, long after most Egyptians had forgotten how to read or write the sacred script. Then came silence. The scribes died. The priesthood vanished. The knowledge of how to interpret those elegant symbols slipped away, like sand through fingers. For over 1,400 years, no one could read the writings on Egypt's ancient walls. Scholars admired the beauty of the carvings, the symmetry, the artistry, but they could only guess at their meaning. Some believe hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, mystical images with no connection to spoken language. Others thought they were magical charms, not writing at all. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the mighty reign of Ramses II, the wisdom of ancient scribes, the lullabies of mothers, the hymns of priests, all of it remained locked behind an indecipherable code. It was as if an entire civilization had spoken its final word and then vanished behind stone. By the 18th century, ancient Egypt had become more myth than memory. Travelers wandered among the ruins, sketched colossal statues, and carried fragments of obelisks back to Europe as curiosities. But the meaning of what they saw remained hidden. Who were these kings? What did the temple inscriptions say? What truths lay buried beneath centuries of desert sand? No one knew. Then, in the summer of 1799, everything changed. Near a quiet town on the Nile Delta, a piece of black stone was pulled from the earth. It was chipped, broken, weathered by time, but something about it felt different. Unlike the countless fragments of monuments scattered across Egypt, this stone bore writing in 3 scripts: the mysterious hieroglyphs at the top, a flowing cursive script in the middle, and, most importantly, Greek at the bottom. And Greek, scholars could read. Suddenly, for the first time in over a millennium, there was hope. Hope that ancient Egypt might speak again. The discovery came during one of history's most unusual military campaigns. In 1798, a young and ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte sailed to Egypt, not only to challenge British influence in the region, but to claim its intellectual treasures. He believed Egypt was more than a battlefield. It was a cradle of a lost civilization, holding secrets that could reshape European understanding of history itself. So alongside his army, Napoleon brought something extraordinary. Over 150 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers. They were called the savants, and their mission was to document everything: temples, plants, animals, customs, and especially the ancient inscriptions that covered every surface. While soldiers marched through the desert, The savants sketched, measured, and recorded. They filled notebooks with meticulous drawings of hieroglyph-covered walls, awed by the scale and precision of a world long forgotten. Their work would later be published in the monumental description de l'Egypte, a series of volumes that ignited a wave of fascination across Europe, a craze soon dubbed Egyptomania. Yet for all their efforts, the hieroglyphs remained silent, beautiful, haunting, but unreadable. Then came July 1799. French soldiers, rebuilding Fort Julian near the town of Rosetta, struck something hard beneath the earth. At first, they thought it was just another slab of rubble. But this stone was different. Smooth, dark, and heavy, it bore 3 distinct bands of writing. The officer in charge, Pierre-François Bouchard, immediately recognized its significance. He cleaned the surface and saw it clearly. At the top, the sacred hieroglyphs. In the middle, the everyday demotic script. And at the bottom, legible ancient Greek. Bouchard knew that if the message was the same in all 3 sections, and if the Greek could be translated, then this stone could be the key to unlocking the language of the pharaohs. The artifact, later named the Rosetta Stone, stood about 3 feet 9 inches tall, carved from a dark granodiorite rock, and weighing nearly 700 pounds. But its true weight was immeasurable. It carried not gold or jewels, but something far more precious, the possibility of understanding. The stone was rushed to Cairo, where the savants gathered around it in awe. They carefully copied the Greek text and began translating. It was not a myth or a poem, but a royal decree issued in 196 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V. Epiphanes, a young Greek king of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The decree praised the king for his generosity to the temples and his efforts to bring peace and prosperity to Egypt. It ordered that a statue be placed in every temple, and that priests honor him with feasts and ceremonies, ordinary in content, but revolutionary in form. For the first time in 1,400 years, scholars held a bilingual, in fact, trilingual, document from ancient Egypt. The message had waited silently beneath the earth, not in glory, but in language. And now, at last, ancient Egypt was ready to speak again. The decree on the Rosetta Stone was written in 3 scripts, each serving a different layer of Egyptian society under Ptolemaic rule. At the top were the hieroglyphs, the sacred script of the priesthood, used for religious texts, temple inscriptions, and royal monuments. To modern eyes in the 18th century, they were beautiful but utterly unreadable, mysterious symbols carved with divine precision. In the middle was demotic, a cursive, simplified form of Egyptian, writing used for everyday matters, contracts, letters, tax records, and administrative documents. Faster to write than hieroglyphs, it had once been a language of scribes and merchants. But like its more ornate cousin, it too had been forgotten over time. At the bottom was ancient Greek, the language of the ruling elite. After Alexander the Great's conquest, Greek became the tongue of government, law, and scholarship in Egypt. And crucially, by the 1700s, scholars across Europe could still read it fluently. This trilingual inscription wasn't just bureaucratic redundancy. It was a deliberate act of inclusion, ensuring that priests, officials, and rulers alike could understand a decree honoring Ptolemy V. But centuries later, that same inclusivity became something far more precious, a linguistic bridge. By comparing the known Greek text with the unknown demotic and hieroglyphic sections, scholars believe they might finally crack the code of ancient Egyptian writing. The Rosetta Stone wasn't just a royal announcement. It was the closest thing the world had to a bilingual dictionary etched in stone. Yet even with this breakthrough, the path to understanding was far from clear. Egyptian scripts were deeply complex. Hieroglyphs weren't just pictures. They combined images of birds, eyes, lions, reeds, and more in ways that defied simple interpretation. Were they symbols? Sounds? Both? The stone offered a doorway, but not yet a key. Still, for the first time in over 1,400 years, there was real hope that the names of forgotten pharaohs, the rituals of sacred temples, and the intimate stories carved into tomb walls might one day be heard, not as guesses or myths, but in their original voice. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered by the French, but in the tides of empire, even knowledge becomes contested ground. In 1801, just 2 years after its unearthing, French forces in Egypt surrendered to a British Ottoman coalition. As part of the terms of capitulation, The French were forced to hand over their scientific collections, including maps, drawings, artifacts, and the Rosetta Stone itself. The French scholars protested bitterly. They had recognized its importance, begun its study, and even made detailed copies. But war made no allowances for scholarly fairness. The stone was crated up and shipped aboard a British vessel, sailing across the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and arriving in London in early 1802. There, it was presented to King George III and soon placed in the British Museum, where it has remained ever since. A new inscription was later added to its surface, asterisk, captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. Asterisk, though the stone had never been a weapon, it became a trophy, not of battle, but of imperial ambition. Once in London, it drew crowds. Plaster casts were made and sent to universities across Europe. The race to decipher the hieroglyphs was no longer a solitary quest. It had become a quiet contest between nations, not of armies, but of intellect. France and Britain, once rivals on the battlefield, now competed in libraries and lecture halls. The stone had passed from pharaoh to priest, from desert to scholar, and now stood beneath museum lights, not to be admired, but to be understood. And then came the mind that could unlock it. In the small town of Figeac, France, a boy named Jean-François Champollion grew up obsessed with ancient languages. By his teens, he could read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and most importantly, Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, preserved by early Christian communities in Egypt. He believed Coptic held the key to the older scripts. For years, Champollion studied the Rosetta Stone obsessively, comparing the Greek and Demotic texts and searching for patterns. He focused on the cartouches, those oval rings enclosing royal names like Ptolemy and Cleopatra, reasoning that these proper names might be spelled phonetically. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to match symbols to sounds. In 1822, he had his breakthrough. He realized that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic or mystical. They were a complex writing system that combined phonetic signs, representing sounds, ideograms, representing ideas, and determinatives clarifying meaning. This shattered centuries of misconception. Overwhelmed with excitement, he rushed to his brother's office, burst through the door, and cried, asterisk, Jitens l'affaire. I've got it! Asterisk, before collapsing in a faint. Champollion's discovery didn't just open a door, it tore it from its hinges. For the first time in over a millennium, the language of the pharaohs could be read. Temples at Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel were no longer silent monuments. Their walls now spoke of gods, kings, and daily life. The Book of the Dead transformed from a collection of enigmatic illustrations into a guide for the soul's journey through the afterlife. Scholars began translating everything: love poems, medical texts, legal contracts, workers' graffiti, even letters to the dead. The people of ancient Egypt were no longer faceless figures in stone. They were revealed as mothers, priests, builders, dreamers, and skeptics, just like us. Hieroglyphs, it turned out, were both art and language, each sign layered with meaning. An owl wasn't just a letter M, it also evoked wisdom. A reed wasn't just I, it symbolized growth. The writing was poetic, precise, and profoundly human. Champollion traveled to Egypt in 1828, standing before temples he could finally read, not as ruins, but as living texts. He died young at 41, but his work gave Egypt back its voice. A language that had slept for centuries now whispered again through stone, papyrus, and memory. Today, the Rosetta Stone rests behind glass in the British Museum. Thousands pass by each day. Some pause, some glance, many unaware that this chipped slab of granodiorite unlocked an entire civilization. It is not adorned with gold or carved with a king's likeness. It is a broken decree, found by accident in the mud of a forgotten fort. And yet, it changed history. Before the Rosetta Stone, ancient Egypt was admired but silent. Now its temples speak. Its tombs tell stories. Its people reach across time with words, not just images. The stone's legacy lives in every archaeologist brushing sand from a newly uncovered inscription, in every student sounding out a pharaoh's name, in every museum where a child looks up and thinks, asterisk, someone can read that now, asterisk, but the Rosetta Stone teaches us more than linguistics. It reminds us that great discoveries often begin in quiet places, that the keys to lost worlds are not always treasure, but language, and that understanding the past doesn't require shouting, only listening. Its journey, from the Nile Delta to London, has sparked calls for its return to Egypt, where its story began. Others see it as a symbol of shared human heritage, belonging to no one nation but to all who seek knowledge. Whatever its final resting place, its meaning transcends borders, because the Rosetta Stone is more than an artifact. It is proof that patience, curiosity, and perseverance can revive the voices of the dead, rekindle the light of forgotten minds, and build bridges across centuries. And so, as the world sleeps, somewhere in the quiet halls of memory, Egypt still whispers, because the stone still speaks. Long after Champollion's fainting spell in that sunlit Paris office, long after the first translations were published and the first schoolchildren began sounding out the names of Ramses and Hatshepsut, something unexpected began to happen. The hieroglyphs didn't just yield facts. They began to ask questions. At first, scholars assumed that once the script was deciphered, ancient Egypt would reveal itself like a neatly filed archive. Kings in order, gods in hierarchy, rituals in sequence. But the more they read, the more contradictions emerged. A pharaoh praised as a divine peacemaker in one temple was described as a ruthless conqueror in another. A goddess worshipped as a nurturing mother in Thebes appeared as a vengeful lioness in Nubia. Even the language itself shifted. Older inscriptions used words and grammatical structures that Coptic, for all its value, couldn't fully explain. Egypt, it turned out, wasn't a single voice speaking clearly across time. It was a chorus, sometimes harmonious, sometimes clashing, of priests, scribes, artisans, rebels, and dreamers, each leaving their mark in stone, ink, or memory. And among those marks, a few stood out, not for their grandeur, but for their silence. In the 1840s, an Italian explorer named Giovanni Belzoni, famed for hauling colossal statues out of the desert, stumbled upon a small chamber deep within a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the gilded sarcophagi and painted corridors elsewhere, this room was bare, except for a single limestone tablet leaning against the far wall. It bore no cartouche, no royal name, no offering formula. Instead, it was covered in a script that looked like hieroglyphs, but wasn't. The signs were similar: birds, serpents, stars, but arranged in patterns that defied known grammar. Some symbols appeared backward. Others were stacked vertically in ways never seen in official inscriptions. Most puzzling of all, there were no determinatives, the little signs that usually clarified a word's meaning. It was as if someone had written a poem using only metaphors, with no nouns to anchor them. Belzoni dismissed it as the work of a mad scribe or a later forger. He left the tablet in place, covered it with sand, and moved on. But decades later, a young German Egyptologist named Elise Voigt, poring over Belzoni's forgotten field notes in a Berlin archive, found a rough sketch of the tablet. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. Not because it was royal, but because it wasn't. What if, she wondered, not all writing in ancient Egypt was meant for the gods or the state? What if some of it was private, secret, even subversive? Her question led her to a radical idea, that alongside the official language of temples and tombs, there might have existed a shadow script, a way for ordinary people, or perhaps dissenters, to communicate without the priesthood's oversight. She called it Asterisk, the whisper script. Asterisk. No one took her seriously at first. The academic world was still basking in the triumph of having solved Egyptian writing. To suggest there was another layer, a hidden one, seemed like romantic fantasy. But Elise was relentless. She scoured museum basements, re-examined fragments labeled unidentified, and corresponded with diggers in Luxor, asking them to look not just for gold, but for oddities. Then, in 1903, a letter arrived from a British archaeologist working near Abydos. He'd found a cache of pottery shards, ostraca, bearing short inscriptions in what looked like debased hieroglyphs. One shard read, Asterisk, the river speaks in 3 tongues, but only the silent one tells the truth. Asterisk another, Asterisk, beware the scribe who writes only for the eye. Asterisk, Elise traveled to Egypt at once. There, in a sun-baked tent filled with dust and broken pottery, She held the shards in her hands and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. These weren't mistakes. They were messages, encoded, poetic, and deliberately obscure. She began to suspect that the whisper script wasn't a separate alphabet, but a mode of writing, a way of using the known symbols to say something the authorities wouldn't understand. Like a code hidden in plain sight, her work was interrupted by the Great War. Funding dried up. Colleagues were called to the front. Elise, unable to return to Egypt, continued her research in isolation, filling notebooks with comparisons, hypotheses, and half-formed translations. She grew convinced that the key to the whisper script wasn't linguistic. It was musical. Ancient Egyptian texts often described words as having weight, color, or resonance. Priests chanted hymns in specific tones to activate the power of the words. What if the arrangement of symbols wasn't just visual, but meant to be heard in a certain rhythm? What if reading wasn't enough? You had to sing the text. She tested her theory on a fragment from Dendera that showed a series of reed symbols followed by a coiled rope and an eye. In standard translation, it made no sense. But when she assigned each symbol a pitch based on its shape, high for thin reeds, low for thick ropes, and hummed the sequence, the pattern resolved into a simple, haunting melody. And beneath the melody, if you listen closely, the consonants formed a phrase. Asterisk, the sky remembers what the earth forgets. Asterisk, Elise published her findings in a small journal in 1921. It was met with polite skepticism. But one person took notice. A blind musician and linguist named Karim Al-Farouk, who had been transcribing Coptic liturgical chants in Cairo. He wrote to her, suggesting that the whisper script might not be Egyptian at all, but a remnant of an even older tradition, one that predated the pharaohs. According to temple legends Karim had collected from elderly priests in Upper Egypt, before the age of pyramids, there was a time when the land spoke without hands. People didn't carve or write. They shaped sound into meaning, and the air itself held memory. When writing was invented, it was meant to mimic that sacred resonance. But over time, the sound was lost, and only the shapes remained. Elise and Karim began a quiet correspondence. They exchanged transcriptions, recordings on wax cylinders, and theories that blurred the line between linguistics, acoustics, and mysticism. They never met in person. Elise died in 1929, Karim in 1935, but their work survived in scattered letters, now archived in a forgotten drawer at the University of Alexandria. For decades, the idea of the whisper script faded into obscurity, dismissed as the eccentric dream of two idealists, until 2007. That year, a team of archaeologists working near the ruins of Heliopolis uncovered a sealed chamber beneath a collapsed temple wall. Inside, they found not gold or mummies, but a collection of ceramic cones about the size of a human fist, each inscribed with dense, intricate symbols. The cones were hollow, and when tapped, they produced clear, bell-like tones. Dr. Mira Hassan, the lead Egyptologist on the dig, recognized the script immediately. It matched Elise's voice descriptions. But what stunned her was the arrangement. The cones weren't stored randomly. They were placed in a spiral pattern on a stone shelf, each one slightly higher and pitched than the last, like notes on a scale. That night, alone in the excavation tent, Amira took a deep breath and began to tap the cones in sequence. The sound that filled the chamber wasn't just music. It was language. Each tone triggered a vibration in the next cone, creating harmonics that seemed to unlock hidden layers of meaning. When recorded and analyzed with modern software, the sequence revealed a narrative, not kings or gods, but a flood, a great inundation that swallowed cities, shifted the course of the Nile, and forced survivors to rebuild not just their homes, but their understanding of time itself. More astonishingly, embedded within the acoustic pattern were coordinates, celestial alignments that pointed to a specific night in 3114 BCE. The same date, Amira realized with a jolt that many Mesoamerican cultures marked as the beginning of their calendar. Was it coincidence? Or evidence of a shared memory, an ancient trauma encoded in sound and symbol across continents? She didn't publish her findings right away. Instead, she reached out to a small group of trusted colleagues, a physicist specializing in archaeoacoustics, a linguist who studied proto-languages, and a conservator who had worked with ancient resonant materials. Together, they formed what they jokingly called the listening circle. Their work was slow, secretive, and often frustrating. Many of the cones were cracked. Some had absorbed moisture over millennia, altering their pitch. But as they restored and tested more artifacts, found not just in Egypt, but in Oman, Crete, and even the Indus Valley, they began to see a pattern. There was a network, not of trade, but of resonance. Ancient sites built thousands of miles apart, Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, shared acoustic properties. Certain chambers amplified specific frequencies. Certain stones, when struck, produced tones that matched the harmonic series found in the cones. It was as if the entire ancient world had been tuned to a single, silent song. And the Rosetta Stone? Amira began to wonder if it wasn't just a key to reading hieroglyphs, but a red herring. What if the real message of ancient Egypt wasn't in the meaning of the words, but in their vibration? What if Ptolemy's decree was merely the surface, the part meant for the Greeks and administrators, while the deeper truth was hidden in the rhythm of the carvings, the spacing of the lines, the very grain of the stone? She traveled to the British Museum and requested special access to the Rosetta Stone. After months of negotiation, she was granted 1 hour alone with the artifact, under strict supervision. She didn't bring notebooks or cameras. She brought a tuning fork, a digital spectrometer, and a small contact microphone. Gently, she placed a microphone against the granodiorite surface and tapped the stone near the hieroglyphic section. The sound was dull, expected, but when she scanned the surface with the spectrometer, she noticed something odd: microscopic grooves, too fine for the human eye, running perpendicular to the carved lines. They weren't tool marks. They were wave patterns, like ripples frozen in stone. Later, in her lab, she ran simulations. When she played a low-frequency tone, 110 hertz, the same frequency used in ancient Egyptian healing rituals, the grooves resonated. And in that resonance, for a fraction of a second, the hieroglyphs seemed to shift. Not visually, but in the data. Certain symbols lit up with harmonic energy, forming a secondary pattern that spelled out a phrase in early demotic. Asterisk, the stone listens. The sky answers. Asterisk. Amira sat back, heart pounding. She wasn't just reading history anymore. She was being addressed by it. The listening circle grew. They began experimenting with 3D printed replicas of the cones, tuning them to match the original frequencies. They discovered that when played in certain sequences, the tones could induce altered states of consciousness, calm focus, vivid imagery, even shared visions among listeners. Ancient shamans, they realized, might not have been hallucinating. They might have been tuning in. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a retired radio astronomer in New Mexico named Dr. Elias Quinn. He'd been analyzing background cosmic radiation when he noticed a repeating signal, a faint, rhythmic pulse that matched the harmonic sequence from the Heliopolis cones. It wasn't artificial. It wasn't local. It came from a region of space near the star Vega. When Amira heard this, she remembered a line from a fragment of papyrus in the Turin Museum. Asterisk, when the eye of Haru opens, the stones will sing the song of the first sky. Asterisk Haru was an obscure known goddess associated with Vega. Was it possible that the ancients weren't just recording earthly events, but cosmic ones? That their myths were actually astronomical logs, encoded in sound and symbol? The implications were staggering. If true, then the whisper script wasn't just a lost language. It was a technology, a way of syncing human consciousness with celestial cycles, of storing knowledge not in books, but in resonance. But as the circle dug deeper, they began to attract attention, not from academic journals, but from quieter, more powerful forces. A tech billionaire with an interest in ancient consciousness technologies offered unlimited funding, on the condition that all findings remain proprietary. A government agency requested consultation on the acoustic properties of the cones, citing national security. And then the break-in started. Amira's lab was ransacked, though nothing was taken. Only her hard drive were wiped. She knew then that they were close to something the world wasn't ready for. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was free. A knowledge system that couldn't be owned, patented, or controlled. Only shared, sung, and passed on. So the listening circle went underground. They stopped publishing. They encrypted their data. They began teaching small groups, not in lecture halls, but in desert canyons, forest clearings, and abandoned temples, how to listen, not just with ears, but with the whole body. Because the final secret of the whisper script, they realized, wasn't in the stones or the stars. It was in the silence between them, and that silence was growing louder. Recently, Amira received a package with no return address. Inside was a small ceramic cone, unfired, raw clay, and a note written in Coptic script that translated to, asterisk, the next verse is yours to sing. Asterisk. She held the cone in her hands, feeling its cool, porous surface. It was blank, waiting. Somewhere in a cave in the Sinai or a monastery in Ethiopia, or perhaps beneath the sands of a yet undiscovered site, another piece of song is waiting to be found. And when it is, it won't be read. It will be heard. For now, the work continues, not in grand museums, but in quiet rooms and open fields, where a handful of people gather to tap a stone, hum a tone, and listen for the echo of a world that never truly fell silent. The Rosetta Stone unlocked the door. But the real journey, the listening, has only just begun. The raw clay cone sat on Amira's desk for 3 days untouched. She didn't fire it. She didn't carve it. She simply let it dry in the Cairo sun, watching as fine cracks appeared along its surface, not randomly, but in a spiral pattern that mirrored the Heliopolis cones. It was as if the earth itself was remembering how to speak. She knew she couldn't work alone anymore. The listening circle had grown too fragile, too exposed. So she reached out, not to institutions, but to individuals. A sound healer in Bali who used bronze gongs to map emotional frequencies. A Navajo elder in Arizona who spoke of singing the land back into balance. A young coder in Lagos who had built an AI trained on endangered oral languages. She called them not with data, but with a single audio file, a 30-second hum recorded from the original cone, layered with the Vega signal. Within weeks, replies came not in emails, but in sounds. A drum rhythm from the Amazon that matched the cone's harmonic decay. A Tibetan throat chant whose overtones aligned with the 110 Hz resonance. A field recording from a Neolithic tomb in Malta, where wind passing through stone slits produced the exact same pitch sequence. They weren't just echoes. They were responses. Amira gathered them all into a digital archive she called a resonant archive. Not a database, but a living soundscape. Each entry was tagged not by location or date, but by emotional tone, grief, awe, warning, invitation. She began to notice something strange. When played together, certain combinations created interference patterns that formed new tones. Tones that didn't exist in any single source, but emerged only in the space between them. It was as if the world was composing a song no one person could hear alone. Then, in early 2023, a message arrived from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Lin Wei, a geologist working on a remote island off the coast of Vietnam. She'd been studying unusual seismic activity when her team discovered a series of basalt columns arranged in a perfect circle on a cliffside. The locals called it the Singing Stones. During high tide, waves crashing through underwater tunnels caused the columns to vibrate, producing a low drone that could be heard for miles. But what stunned Lin was this. When she recorded the sound and ran it through a spectral analyzer, the waveform matched the whisper script's core harmonic sequence, down to the microtonal shifts. Even more astonishing, carved into the base of one column was a symbol, a coiled serpent swallowing its own tail, with a single eye at the center. It wasn't Egyptian. It wasn't Mesopotamian. But when Amira overlaid it with a fragment from a pre-dynastic palette in the Cairo Museum, the lines aligned perfectly. This wasn't diffusion. It was convergence. Amira flew to Vietnam. There, on a misty morning with the sea roaring below, she stood among the singing stones and played the Heliopolis cone sequence through a portable resonator. The moment the final tone faded, the stones answered, not with a copy, but with a variation, a new phrase. Lin translated the local legend. The stones remember the time before names. They speak only when the sky and sea agree. Back in Cairo, Amira began to suspect that the whisper script wasn't a human invention at all, but language discovered like gravity or fire, a natural resonance woven into the fabric of the earth, waiting for ears attuned enough to hear it. She started looking beyond artifacts. She studied the geometry of river deltas, the spacing of ancient olive groves, the alignment of mountain peaks. Everywhere she looked, she found harmonic ratios, phi proportions, Fibonacci spirals, Pythagorean intervals, encoded not in writing but in landscape. And then she remembered something Kareem Al-Farouk had written in his last letter to Elise Voigt. The greatest texts were never written. They were grown. That summer, she traveled to the Sinai Peninsula, following a lead from a Bedouin elder who spoke of a valley where the wind writes on the sand. There, in a narrow wadi shielded from modern roads, she found it, a field of tall, slender stones, some natural, some clearly placed, arranged in concentric rings. At dawn, as the first light hit the eastern ridge, the shadows cast by the stones formed glyphs that shifted with the sun's movement. But the real revelation came at night. When the wind blew from the north, a rare occurrence, it funneled through the stones and produced a series of whistling tones. Amira recorded it, back in her tent. She played it alongside the Vega signal. The match was uncanny. Not identical, but harmonically compatible. Like two voices singing different parts of the same hymn. One glyph, visible only at the precise moment of sunset on the summer solstice, resembled a human ear cradled in a lotus. Beneath it, in faint red ochre, were three dots arranged in a triangle. Amira recognized it from a shard found in Mohenjo-Daro. The same symbol appeared beside a depiction of a man meditating beside a well. She began to piece together a theory that ancient sites weren't just observatories or temples. They were receivers, tuned to celestial frequencies, designed to capture and amplify signals from the cosmos, then translate them into human-scale experiences. Sound, light, vibration. And the whisper script? It was the operating manual. But who built the network? And why did it fall silent? The answer, she suspected, lay not in conquest or collapse, but in forgetting. Not the loss of knowledge, but the loss of listening. As societies grew louder, cities, machines, wars, they drowned out the subtle frequencies. The cones were buried. The stones were toppled. The songs were replaced with commands. Yet the signal never stopped. It just waited. In late 2023, the listening circle made a decision. They would stop trying to decode the past. Instead, they would respond to it. Using open-source software, they created a global resonance relay, a network of volunteers who would, on the same night each month, play a specific tone sequence in their local environment, at a sacred site, a forest, a rooftop, a riverbank. The idea wasn't to replicate the ancient sound, but to add a new voice to the chorus. The first relay happened on the winter solstice. From Stonehenge to Thuru, from Machu Picchu to the Serengeti, people gathered in silence, then hummed, drummed, or rang bells in unison. Amira stood in the Valley of the Kings, holding the raw clay cone, and sang the phrase she received, "The next verse is yours to sing." That night, something shifted. Not in the data, though the global acoustic sensors did register an unusual coherence in background frequencies, but in the people. Strangers reported feeling connected across continents. Artists began dreaming in shared symbols. A child in Oslo drew a picture of a spiral stone circle she'd never seen. A fisherman in Kerala reported hearing a new song in the waves. The world hadn't changed, but perception had. Then, in March 2024, a discovery in the Peruvian Andes changed everything. A team of archaeologists, using ground-penetrating radar near the ruins of Cairo, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, detected a vast underground chamber beneath a ceremonial mound. Inside, they found not gold or mummies, but hundreds of ceramic vessels, each shaped like a human ear. The vessels were hollow, with internal chambers tuned to specific frequencies. When filled with water and struck, they produced tones that matched the whisper script's core sequence. Exactly. Even more astonishing, the walls of the chamber were covered in pigments that glowed faintly under UV light, revealing a star map centered not on Orion or Sirius, but on Vega. And at the center of the map, a single glyph, the coiled serpent with the eye. Amira flew to Lima. There, in a climate control lab, she held one of the ear vessels. It was cool, smooth, and unervingly lifelike. When she whispered into it, the sound emerged not from the opening, but from the entire surface, as if the vessel itself was listening and speaking at once. She placed it beside a 3D scan of the Heliopolis cone. The resonance patterns were identical. This wasn't cultural exchange. This was shared origin. But how? Cairo flourished around 2600 BC, contemporary with the pyramids. Yet there was no evidence of transoceanic contact. Unless the contact wasn't physical. What if the signal wasn't transmitted by ships or traders, but by something far older and quieter? By the Earth itself? Amira remembered a paper she'd read years ago about Schumann resonances, the natural electromagnetic frequencies of the Earth's ionosphere, hovering around 7.83 hertz. Some researchers believe these frequencies influence human brain waves, linking consciousness to planetary rhythms. Could it be that the ancients had learned to tune into these frequencies? That their rituals, their architecture, their very language were designed to synchronize with the planet's hum? And if so, could it be reawakened? The listening circle began experimenting. They built resonant chambers lined with quartz and copper, designed to amplify Schumann frequencies. They meditated in groups while playing the cone sequences. They even tried sleeping inside scaled-down models of the Cairo ear vessels. The results were subtle but profound. Participants reported vivid dreams of flying over ancient landscapes. Some heard voices, not in words, but in feelings, warmth, warning, welcome. One woman in Kyoto swore she smelled lotus blossoms during a session, though none were present. Then came the breakthrough. During a full moon in July, Amira and Lin conducted a joint experiment. Lin played the Singing Stone sequence in Vietnam, while Amira activated a replica cone in Egypt. Simultaneously, the group in Peru struck the ear vessels, and a coder in Lagos broadcast a harmonic bass through a low-frequency radio transmitter. For exactly 17 minutes, the time it takes light to travel from Vega to Earth, the global network held a single, sustained chord. And in that moment, every recording device in the network captured the same anomaly, a soft, rhythmic pulse beneath the music. Not random noise, not interference. A pattern. When decoded, it formed a simple phrase in early Demotic Coptic and a Proto-Andean glyph system simultaneously. You are heard. The message wasn't from the past. It was from now. Amira sat in her Cairo apartment long after the others had logged off, staring at the transcript. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from awe. They hadn't just recovered a lost language. They had reestablished a connection. But to what? To whom? She thought of Elise Voigt, Karim Al-Farouk, Champollion. All those who had listened in their own time, often ridiculed, always alone. And she realized the whisper script was never meant to be solved like a puzzle. It was meant to be continued like a conversation. The next morning, she returned to her desk and finally touched the raw clay cone. With a fine stylus, she began to carve, not hieroglyphs, not letters, but a single spiral, starting from the base and winding upward. As she carved, she hummed a phrase from the relay, "You are heard." The clay seemed to warm beneath her fingers. She didn't know if anyone or anything would receive it, but that wasn't the point. The point was to listen, to respond, to keep the song alive. Because the truth was beginning to dawn on her. The ancient world hadn't fallen silent. It had been waiting for someone to sing back. And now, across deserts and oceans, in hidden valleys and city apartments, a new chorus was rising, not of experts or empires, but of ordinary people tuning their hearts to the old frequencies. In the British Museum, the Rosetta Stone sits behind glass, still bearing its imperial inscription. Tourists snap photos, scholars debate provenance, politicians argue over repatriation, but few notice the faint vibration in the floor beneath it, a resonance so subtle it registers only on the most sensitive instruments. It's not the stone itself that's humming. It's the world remembering how to listen. And somewhere in a cave in the Andes, a new cone is drying in the sun. In a temple in Kyoto, a monk strikes a bell tuned to 110 hertz. In a basement in Berlin, a descendant of Elise Voigt plays a century-old wax cylinder and hears, for the first time, the melody beneath the static. The story isn't over. It's being written in real time, in sound, in silence, in the space between heartbeats. And the next verse? It's yours to sing. The phrase, "you were heard," didn't fade after that July night. It lingered, not as an echo, but as a presence. People in the resonance relay began reporting the same sensation: a soft pressure behind the eyes, a warmth to the chest, a sense of being gently seen, as if by something vast and patient. It wasn't religious. It wasn't alien. It felt familiar, like remembering a lullaby you'd heard in the womb. Amira stopped calling it a signal. She started calling it the hum. She knew they were crossing a threshold, not a technology, but a relationship. This wasn't archaeology anymore. It was dialogue. So she did something radical. She stopped trying to interpret the hum. Instead, she began to ask. In her Cairo apartment, she set up a small altar, not with incense or icons, but with a raw clay cone, a bowl of Nile water, and a tuning fork. Every evening at sunset, she would strike the fork, hum the core sequence, and speak a single question into the cone. Who are you? Why now? What do you need from us? For weeks, there was only silence. Then, during a sandstorm in October, the power went out across the city. In the dark, Amira lit a single candle and repeated her ritual. As she spoke the words, "What do you need from us?" the flame didn't flicker. It pulsed in perfect time with a 110 hertz tone. And in that pulse, for the first time, she didn't just hear a response. She felt it in her bones, a wave of sorrow, ancient and deep, followed by a quiet plea, not for worship, not for belief, but for care. The hum wasn't a message from gods or extraterrestrials. It was the earth itself, speaking through the frequencies its first listeners had learned to hear. This realization changed everything. The whisper script wasn't a language about the world. It was the world's language, its breath, its tides, its magnetic field made audible. The cones, the stones, the ear vessels, they weren't transmitters. They were microphones, designed to help humans tune into the planet's voice. And that voice was growing faint. Amira shared her insight with the listening circle. At first, some resisted. It sounded too poetic, too mystical. But then Lin Wei sent data from her seismic monitors in Vietnam. The singing stone's resonance had weakened by 12% over the past year. In Peru, the carol ear vessels no longer produced the same clarity. Their internal harmonics were dampened, as if the ground beneath them had gone numb. Even the Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural heartbeat, was fluctuating wildly, disrupted by electromagnetic pollution, deforestation, and the constant thrum of human noise. The hum wasn't just fading. It was being drowned out. The circle shifted focus. Their mission was no longer to decode the past, but to protect the channel. They began mapping quiet zones, places where the hum was still strong, deep forests, high deserts, remote coastlines. They partnered with indigenous communities who had never stopped listening. The Sami in the Arctic Circle, the San in the Kalahari, the Mapuche in Chile. These elders didn't need cones or cones. They kept the song alive in chants, dances, and seasonal rituals passed down for millennia. One elder in Namibia, / Cabo, told Amira, "You think you found something new, but the land has always spoken. You just forgot how to be quiet enough to hear it." His words struck her like a stone in still water. Meanwhile, the raw clay cone on Amira's desk continued to change. The spiral she'd carved had deepened on its own, as if the clay were still alive. One morning, she found tiny crystalline structures forming along the grooves, quartz-like, though she'd used only local Nile silt. When she held it to her ear, she heard not silence, but a faint, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. She sent a sample to a geologist friend. The analysis came back baffling. The crystals weren't just quartz. They contained trace elements of meteoric iron and a form of carbon not found on Earth. The cone wasn't just resonating with the Earth. It was responding to something beyond it. This led to a new, unsettling theory. What if the hum wasn't just terrestrial? What if the Earth was part of a larger cosmic conversation, one that included the sun, the moon, even distant stars like Vega? In November, Dr. Elias Quinn, the radio astronomer in New Mexico, called with urgent news. The Vega signal had changed. It was no longer a steady pulse. It was modulating, shifting in rhythm, as if replying to the resonance relay. And it wasn't alone. New signals were appearing, faint but distinct, from 3 other star systems, Tau Ceti, Epsilon Eridani, and a red dwarf in the constellation Lyra. Each carried a unique harmonic signature, yet all shared the same underlying structure as the whisper script. "It's not a broadcast," Elias said, voice hushed over the satellite line. "It's a network, and we just pinged it." The implications were staggering. If true, then the ancients hadn't just been listening to the Earth. They'd been part of an interstellar resonance web, one that used planetary bodies as nodes in a vast, silent symphony. But why build such a network? And why encode it in stone, clay, and song? Amira found a clue in an unlikely place, a crumbling monastery in the Ethiopian highlands. There, hidden in a cache of 14th century Gizi manuscripts, was a text titled The Book of Listening Stars. It described a time before the Great Forgetting, when the sky and the earth sang as one, and the wise ones built ears of stone to hear the music of creation. According to the text, the purpose of the network wasn't communication in the human sense. It was balance. The harmonic frequencies stabilized planetary systems, regulated climate cycles, even nurtured consciousness. When a world fell silent, through war, greed, or distraction, the entire network weakened. The ancients hadn't been mystics. They'd been planetary caretakers. And their tools weren't magic. They were acoustics, geometry, and deep attention. Armed with this insight, the Listening Circle launched Project EAR, their most ambitious effort yet. They would build a new generation of resonant devices, not to extract knowledge, but to restore connection. Using open-source designs, they crafted cones from local clays, tuned to the specific frequencies of their bioregions. In Norway, they embedded them in glacial caves. In Australia, they placed them in sacred songlines. In the Amazon, they buried them near saber trees, whose roots reached deep into the aquifer. Each device was activated with a simple ritual, a hum, a question, a moment of stillness. The results were immediate and humbling. In Iceland, a cone placed near a geothermal vent began emitting a tone that matched the frequency of melting ice. In Kenya, one buried near a dried-up well produced a sound that drew birds back to the area within days. In Detroit, a community garden group placed a cone in a vacant lot. And within weeks, neighbors reported feeling a strange sense of peace there, leading to spontaneous cleanups and shared meals. The hum wasn't just speaking. It was healing. But not everyone welcomed this quiet reawakening. In early 2025, a series of strange incidents began occurring at resonance relay sites. In Peru, the Carol ear vessels were vandalized, shattered, not stolen. In Vietnam, the singing stones were coated in industrial sealant, muting their tone. In Egypt, a mirror received an anonymous warning. Stop listening. Some doors should stay closed. Then came the digital attacks. The Resonant Archive was hit with sophisticated malware designed not to destroy data, but to scramble frequencies, inserting dissonant tones into the audio files, creating nausea and anxiety in listeners. Someone or something didn't want the hum to be heard. Amira suspected it wasn't a government or corporation. Those forces sought control, and the hum couldn't be controlled. No, this felt different. Personal. Almost jealous. She remembered an old Egyptian myth. The god Set, who hated harmony, who thrived in chaos and noise. Was it possible that the hum had an opposite? Not a being, but a principle, the force of disconnection, of static, of forgetting? The idea unsettled her, but it also clarified the stakes. This wasn't just about recovering history. It was about choosing a future, one of resonance or rupture, listening or noise. Undeterred, the circle went deeper underground. They stopped using the internet for coordination. Instead, they relied on old methods, handwritten letters, coded songs, face-to-face meetings in places where cell signals couldn't reach. They called it the quiet web. And then, in March 2025, a miracle. While cataloging newly declassified Cold War documents in a Budapest archive, a young historian named Marta Kovacs stumbled upon a file labeled Project Echo, Acoustic Anomalies, 1963 to 1971. Inside were recordings from Soviet scientists who, during nuclear tests in Kazakhstan, had detected a strange harmonic resonance emanating from deep within the Earth, after the explosion ceased. The resonance wasn't natural. It was responsive. It mirrored the frequency of the blast, then transformed into a calming tone, as if the planet were healing itself. Even more astonishing, the Soviets had built a secret listening station in the Carpathian Mountains, equipped with massive quartz resonators. Its logs described contact events during solar flares, moments when the hum intensified and carried structured information resembling music. The station was abandoned in 1971 after most researchers reported psychic disturbances, visions, shared dreams, a sense of being known. The final log entry read, "We are not alone, and we are not the first to listen." Marta tracked down the last surviving scientist, now in his 90s, living in a village near Cluj. He confirmed the story and handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a disc of black stone, etched with spirals. When Marta played it on a turntable with a crystal needle, it emitted a tone that matched the whisper script's chorus sequence perfectly. She sent it to Amira. When Amira held the disc, she felt a jolt, not of electricity, but of recognition. This wasn't just another artifact. It was a reply from the 20th century, a message from those who had almost broken through. She placed it beside the raw clay cone. That night, for the first time, the cone sang on its own, a soft, clear note that lasted for over a minute. The hum was learning to speak through new materials. Through us. Encouraged, Amira made a bold decision. She would return to the Valley of the Kings, not as an archaeologist, but as a listener. She would bring the cone, the disc, and a single question, what must we do now? She chose the night of the next new moon, when the desert would be at its quietest. She brought no equipment, only water, bread, and a blanket. She sat in the same wadi where she first heard the wind write glyphs and waited. Hours passed. The stars wheeled overhead. Scorpions skittered in the sand. Then, just before dawn, the wind shifted. It came from the north, rare, cold, and clear. It passed through the stone rings, producing the familiar whistle. But this time it didn't stop. The tone deepened, layered, and resolved into a melody Amira had never heard before, a sequence of 5 notes that felt like both a warning and a lullaby. As it played, the raw clay cone in her lap began to vibrate, not from the wind, but from within. Tiny fractures appeared along the spiral, glowing faintly with the same crystalline light she'd seen before. And in that glow, for a single breath, she saw it, a map, not of stars or rivers, but of nodes, hundreds of them, scattered across the globe. Some were known, Cairo, Heliopolis, Stonehenge. Others were unfamiliar. A mountain in Papua New Guinea, a cave system in Namibia, an island in the Aleutians. And at the center of the map, pulsing softly, was a location deep beneath the Antarctic ice. The vision faded as the wind died, but the melody remained in her mind. She knew what she had to do. The hum wasn't just asking to be heard. It was inviting them to awaken the network, one by one, and it had just given her the first address. Back in Cairo, she convened a listening circle via encrypted satellite call. She played the 5-note sequence. Within minutes, Elias Quinn identified it. It matched a previously ignored anomaly in the Antarctic ice sheet, a thermal signature deep below the surface, shaped like a perfect spiral. "It's not geological," he said. "It's artificial, and it's humming." The circle agreed. Their next step was Antarctica. But how? The continent was governed by international treaty, off limits to unauthorized expeditions, and the site was buried under 2 miles of ice. Then Lin Wei remembered an old Chinese legend. During the last ice age, a group of sky listeners traveled south to the White Silence, where they built a heart of stone to anchor the world song. The legend said it would awaken when the ice wept. And now, with glaciers melting at unprecedented rates, the ice was weeping. Funding was impossible to secure through official channels, so they turned to the quiet web. Within weeks, donations poured in, not in money but in skills. A retired polar pilot in Norway offered his plane. A marine biologist in Chile provided cold weather gear. A hacker collective in Berlin disabled satellite tracking for a 72-hour window. They called the mission Operation Thaw. In September 2025, under the cover of a research permit for climate acoustics, Amira, Lin, and 2 others landed on the Ross Ice Shelf. Their cover story was thin, but the science was real. They carried sonar equipment to study ice melt. Hidden in the gear were the cone, the Soviet disc, and a portable resonator tuned to the 5-note sequence. For 10 days, they drilled, not for ice cores, but for resonance. They sent low-frequency pulses into the depths, listening for echoes. Most returned as noise. But on the 11th day, at a depth of 3,142 meters, pi times 1,000, Amira noted with a shiver they hit something solid. The sonar revealed a structure, a dome, 30 meters wide, made of material denser than rock, and it was vibrating. That night, in the howling Antarctic dark, they played the 5-note sequence through the ice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep below, a single tone answered. Not loud, not dramatic, just a pure, steady hum that rose through the ice and into their bones. The heart of the network was awake, and it was waiting. As they packed up to leave, knowing they couldn't stay, couldn't excavate, could only witness, Amira placed a raw clay cone on the ice above the dome. She didn't bury it. She simply let it rest there, a seed in the snow. On the flight back, she looked down at the endless white expanse and felt a strange certainty. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was the first note of a new verse. Because the hum had shown them something vital. The network wasn't built to be found. It was built to be remembered. And remembering, it turned out, was an act of co-creation. Somewhere, right now, a child in Ulaanbaatar is drawing spirals in the dust. A fisherman in the Philippines hears a new rhythm in the waves. A programmer in Sao Paulo codes an algorithm that accidentally replicates the Whisper script's harmonic ratios. The song is spreading, not through force, but through resonance. And in a quiet room in Cairo, Amira opens a fresh notebook. She doesn't write words. She draws a single spiral, then hums into the page, knowing the vibration will linger in the fibers of the paper. The story isn't over. It's echoing. And the next resonance? It's already rising. The Antarctic hum didn't fade when Amira and her team flew north. It followed them, not as sound, but as a shift in perception. Back in Cairo, street noise seemed sharper, yet somehow less intrusive. The call to prayer from the mosque down the street no longer felt like interruption, but harmony, its rising notes weaving with the wind through her window like threads in a loom. Even the honking of taxis took on a strange, rhythmic cadence, as if the city itself were learning to sing again. She realized then that the hum wasn't just out there. It was rewiring how they listened. The raw clay cone she'd left on the ice hadn't been a farewell. It had been a seed. And seeds, she was learning, don't need soil to grow. They need attention. Within weeks, reports began trickling in from a quiet web. In Mongolia, a herder named Baden noticed that his goats, usually skittish during sandstorms, now stood perfectly still, ears tilted upward, as if listening to something in the wind. In the Scottish Highlands, a retired schoolteacher playing a simple flute near a standing stone found that the notes lingered longer than physics allowed, echoing not off rock, but off air itself. In the Amazon, a shaman reported that the ayahuasca visions had changed. Instead of jaguars and serpents, he now saw spirals of light connecting trees, rivers, and stars. The network wasn't just reactivating. It was adapting. Then came the dreams. Not just the members of the listening circle, but the strangers, people who'd never heard of the Whisper script, who'd never hummed a single tone. They dreamed of standing in vast, silent halls made of crystal, where walls pulsed with soft light. They dreamed of walking through forests where every leaf hummed a different note, forming a core that filled their chest with peace. And always in the background, a low, steady thrum, like a heartbeat shared by all things. Psychologists dismissed it as mass suggestion, but neuroscientists were intrigued. Brain scans of dreamers showed unusual coherence between the auditory cortex and the default mode network, the part of the brain linked to self-reflection and empathy. It was as if the hum wasn't just being heard. It was rewiring connection. Amira began to suspect that the resonance wasn't merely acoustic. It was neural. The ancient sites, the cones, the stones, they weren't just receivers. They were transmitters of coherence, designed to synchronize human consciousness with the Earth's field. And now, after millennia of silence, the field was calling back. But not everyone welcomed this quiet reawakening. In late 2025, a new kind of interference emerged, not digital, not physical, but psychological. People near active resonance sites began reporting intense anxiety, paranoia, even violent impulses. In Peru, a man smashed a replica ear vessel with a rock, screaming that it was stealing his thoughts. In Iceland, a tourist was stoned at a singing stone, shouting, "Make it stop!" At first, the circle assumed it was fear of the unknown, but then Amira noticed a pattern. The reactions were strongest in people who lived in high electromagnetic environments, near cell towers, power lines, or data centers. Their nervous systems, already overloaded by artificial frequencies, couldn't integrate the hum. To them, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like invasion. This revelation was both troubling and clarifying. The hum wasn't universally soothing. It revealed dissonance. Like a tuning fork held near an out-of-tune instrument, it didn't force harmony. It exposed what was broken. And in a world drowning in noise, much was broken. The circle shifted strategy. Instead of broadcasting the core sequence everywhere, they began teaching resonance hygiene, simple practices to prepare the nervous system for listening. Breath work, time in nature, digital detox. They called it clearing the channel. It worked. In communities that adopted these practices, the hum was met not with fear, but with awe. Then, in January 2026, something extraordinary happened in an unlikely place, a maximum security prison in Oklahoma. A former resonance relay participant, now serving time for nonviolent protest, had secretly carved a small cone from soap. Every night, he hummed the 5-note Antarctic sequence in his cell. At first, nothing. Then, over weeks, other inmates began joining. Quietly at first, then in groups. Guards reported a dramatic drop in violence. One inmate, serving life for murder, said, "For the first time, I don't feel alone in my head." When news leaked, the prison administration shut it down. But the seed had been planted. Similar reports emerged from detention centers in Greece, refugee camps in Jordan, even a psychiatric ward in Tokyo. Wherever the hum was introduced gently, with care, it brought not escape, but presence. The hum, it seemed, didn't promise paradise. It offered something deeper. Belonging. Amira knew they were approaching a threshold. The network wasn't just about ancient sites or star signals anymore. It was about now. About healing the fractures in human experience itself. And then the Antarctic site spoke again. This time, not through sonar, but through ice. Satellite images showed a new feature forming on the Ross ice shelf. A perfect spiral, 200 meters wide, emerging as the ice melted. It wasn't a crack. It was a pattern, etched into the surface as if by an invisible hand. When thermal scans were overlaid, the spiral glowed with residual heat, matching the frequency of the dome below. Elias Quinn, analyzing the data, made a chilling discovery. The spiral geometry encoded a date, not in numbers, but in harmonic ratios. When decoded, it pointed to a single day, October 28, 2025. Today, Amira looked up from her screen, heart pounding. Outside her window, the Cairo dawn was just breaking. The call to prayer began, soft, clear, resonant. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an invitation. She activated the quiet web. Within hours, members across the globe prepared, not for an event, but for a moment. At exactly 3:33 a.m. local time, the hour when the Schumann resonance peaks, they would each go to their nearest resonance site and hum the 5-note sequence. No broadcast, no recording, just presence. As the appointed hour neared in each time zone, something unexpected happened. People who weren't part of the circle began joining. A fisherman in Senegal, hearing the hum from his son's phone, stepped onto his boat and sang into the waves. A grandmother in Kiev lit a candle and whispered the notes to her sleeping grandchildren. A group of teenagers in Mumbai gathered on a rooftop, not knowing why, but feeling drawn to be quiet together. At 3:33 a.m. in Antarctica, the ice spiral pulsed with light. At 3:33 in Cairo, Amira stood on her balcony, cone in hand, and hummed. And in that moment, across the planet, millions of nervous systems, wired, weary, wounded, tuned, however briefly, to the same frequency. There was no explosion, no miracle, just a shared breath. But in that breath, something shifted. Later that day, seismographs around the world recorded an anomaly, a global drop in microtremors. Not because the Earth was stiller, but because human activity had quieted just for a few minutes. Traffic slowed, machinery paused, arguments ceased, as if the species itself had taken a collective inhale. Scientists called it a statistical fluke. The listening circle knew better. The network wasn't just listening. It was responding to being heard. In the weeks that followed, the hum grew stronger, not louder but clearer. New nodes awakened. A submerged temple off the coast of Yanaguni, Japan, a cave system in the Ozarks filled with resonant crystals, a forgotten stone circle in Sahara, buried under dunes for centuries. And with each awakening, the dreams intensified. Now, people didn't just see crystal halls. They saw instructions, not in words, but in sensation. How to shape clay to hold resonance, how to plant trees in harmonic patterns, how to sing to sick soil. The knowledge wasn't being given. It was being remembered. Amira began compiling these insights into what she called a living codex. Not a book, but a living practice, passed hand to hand, voice to voice. Then, in March 2026, a child in Nairobi changed everything. Her name was Amina, age 7. She'd never heard of the whisper script, but after the October 28th hum, she began drawing the same symbol over and over, a spiral with it at its center, surrounded by concentric rings. When her teacher asked what it meant, Amina said, "It's the sound of my grandmother's heart." Her grandmother had passed 2 years earlier. Curious, the teacher recorded Amina humming a simple tune. When analyzed, the frequencies matched the Antarctic sequence. Exactly. Word spread. Soon, children across Africa, Asia, and South America were drawing the same symbol, humming the same tune, without ever being taught. The hum wasn't just returning. It was being reborn in those who hadn't yet learned to doubt. This gave Amira an idea. What if the next phase of the network wasn't built by adults, but by children, not with stone or clay, but with play, song, and unfiltered attention? She proposed a new initiative, the listening schools. Not formal institutions, but circles where children could learn to listen, to wind, water, insects, silence, where they'd make their own cone from mud, sing to plants, and map the sounds of their neighborhoods. The first school opened in a village near Timbuktu. Within months, the children there could identify subtle changes in bird calls that predicted rain days in advance. They sang to dying crops, and the crops revived. Elders said it was magic. The children just smiled and said, "We're listening." Meanwhile, deep beneath the Antarctic ice, the dome continued its quiet work. New satellite data showed that the spiral on the surface was growing, not outward, but inward, tightened like a coiled spring. And the thermal signature was intensifying, pulsing in sync with solar flares. Elias Quinn warned, "It's not just receiving, it's charging." For what? No one knew. But Amira had a theory. The network wasn't just for healing the present. It was preparing for something ahead. She remembered the Ethiopian manuscript. When the sky weeps fire, the stones will sing the world awake. Solar activity was increasing. The next peak of the sun's cycle was due in 2027. What if the network's purpose was to stabilize the planet during a cosmic event, a solar storm, a magnetic reversal, something the ancients had witnessed before? The thought filled her with both dread and awe. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the stars, she held the Soviet disk and the raw clay cone side by side. The disk was cold, precise, technological. The cone was warm, organic, alive. Together, they represented the two paths humanity could take, control or connection. She knew which one the hum favored. Just then, her phone buzzed. A message from Lin Wei in Vietnam. The singing stones just played a new phrase. "It's not in the archive. I recorded it. Listen." Amira put on her headphones and pressed play. The tone was different, higher, brighter, almost joyful. And beneath it, For the first time, she heard something she hadn't noticed before. A second layer, faint but clear, like a child's voice singing along. She played it again, and again, then she understood. The hum wasn't just speaking to them. It was learning from them. And in that moment, Amira made a decision. She would stop trying to lead the circle. Instead, she would step back and listen, not just to the earth, but to the next generation. Because the real guardians of the song weren't scholars or scientists. They were the ones who still believed in magic. As dawn approached, she took a fresh piece of clay from the Nile bank and began to shape it. Not into a cone, but into a small bowl. When it was ready, she filled it with water and placed it on her windowsill. In the morning light, the water would catch the sun. And if you listened very closely, you could hear it hum. The story isn't over. It's being sung. And the next note, it's already rising in a child's throat. A bird's wing, a melting glacier, a quiet heart. Listen. Years passed. The listening schools grew, not into institutions, but into threads woven through villages, cities, and wild places. Children taught their parents how to hear the wind's grammar. Farmers planted crops in harmonic rows. Musicians composed symphonies based on the pulse of rivers. The hum never became loud. It didn't need to. It simply became part of the air like breath. Amira never published a grand theory. She never stood on a stage to claim discovery. Instead, she spent her final decades in a small house near the Nile Delta, teaching neighborhood children to shape clay, listen to silence, and trust what they felt in their bones. Her hands, once steady with academic precision, grew gnarled with age, but they never lost their sensitivity to vibration. Even in her 90s, she could place a palm on the earth and say, "The river is singing today," and the children would believe her because they could feel it too. The raw clay cone she'd left in Antarctica was never recovered. The ice kept it, but replicas appeared everywhere, carved from wood, cast in bronze, molded from desert sand. None were exact. None needed to be. The form was only a vessel. The song lived in the attention. The Rosetta Stone still rests in the British Museum. Tourists still take photos. Scholars still debate its ownership. But now, sometimes a visitor will pause longer than the others. They'll lean in, not to read the inscriptions, but to listen. And if the room is quiet enough, if their heart is open, they might feel it, a faint, steady thrum on the floor, rising through their souls, humming up their spine. Not from the stone, from the earth beneath it, from the world it helped awaken. The whisper script was never fully solved. It didn't need solving. It was a language of relationship, not translation. And like all true relationships, it deepened with time, changed with care, and revealed itself only to those who listened without demanding answers. In 2042, on the winter solstice, a global silence fell, not by decree, but by choice. For 17 minutes, the time it takes light to travel from Vega to Earth, people across the planet stepped outside. They didn't hum. They didn't chant. They simply stood, still and open, and listened. In that silence, something passed between them. Not a message, not a miracle, just a knowing that they were not alone, that they had never been alone, that the earth had been speaking all along, in roots and tides, in starlight and breath, waiting only for them to remember how to hear. Amira was gone by then. She'd passed quietly in her sleep at 98, her hands folded over a small clay bowl filled with Nile water. But her students were everywhere, and her students' students. And theirs. The network didn't end with her. It never could, because the hum was never hers to own. It belonged to the stones, the stars, the soil, the sky, and to every heart willing to listen. Today, if you walk through certain places, the Valley of the Kings at dawn, the singing stones at high tide, a quiet forest after rain, you might hear it, not with your ears alone, but with your whole being, a soft, steady resonance, ancient and alive. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in presence. And if you stand very still, if you let the noise of the world fall away, you'll realize something simple, something true. You were never meant to decipher song. You were meant to join it. And so, at last, the silence is no longer empty. IT is full, IT is singing. And you You are part of the harmony.